Hello and welcome to another Cliff Reviews Art House. This time I'm reviewing the film Red Rooms, directed by Pascal Plante. This film is very dark. It's a horror film and it's about the horrific murder of 3 girls, an act which was filmed and then broadcast live on the dark web. It's terrifying, but it's so well made. It's a really impressive piece of work. It's so scary and horrific, and it raises many interesting questions. It has various layers and themes, yet we see no blood or gore. The film doesn't need to show us the blood and the horror. We do hear a little bit of it, but not too much. A lot of the horror actually comes from suggestion, from ideas, and sometimes from looking at the face of someone looking at the horror. It's definitely what you would call a psychological horror film. At the same time, there are so many ambiguities in this film. We're never quite sure the motivation of the people that we're watching, but it sweeps us along, and there's a real WTF moment in this film. The film keeps us uncertain and subverts any comfort we might feel that we start getting with what this film is about. I missed this film when it was released a few months ago, but I knew it was one that I definitely wanted to catch up with, and I'm so glad I did. As I say, this film is really well made. It starts off in a slow way. It's a murder trial in court. The judge speaks to the jury, then we hear both lawyers' opening statements. It actually runs for about 20 minutes like this, which might sound like it's boring for a horror or a thriller film, but somehow it's gripping right from the start. It's a clever device using these 3 speeches to give us a lot of information about the case and about the different sides of the case. It's clear that the evidence isn't necessarily conclusive, that there are big ambiguities and questions about the guilt of the accused. I'm not sure why this opening scene is so gripping. There's something about the sterile, clinical nature of the courtroom. It's so white, so minimal, so clean. It's like the law is providing us with a certainty that we can trust the legal process, that the wrongs will be put right. Yet the film completely subverts this as it develops. We have the rug pulled away from us at several points. We're left wondering what's going on, who are the good people and who are the bad people in this film. This is great storytelling. It requires a bit of patience and intelligence, I think. The film definitely doesn't want to serve us anything on a plate, yet it's telling the story in a really compelling way. I found I just couldn't take my eyes off it. This does become a kind of whodunit thriller, and as it gathers pace, it really starts to sweep us along. The story centres around a woman, Kellyanne, who's clearly obsessed with this trial. I mentioned that the first 20 minutes all focuses around the court case. The camera slowly moves around the court during this period, but then it has this wide shot of the jury and it starts to zoom in. It becomes clear that we're zooming in on a particular woman, but it still takes time to get there, and this turns out to be Kellyanne. There's another woman that becomes friends with Kellyanne. Clementine is also obsessed by the trial, and the 2 of them buddy up for a while. They're both important as, in terms of understanding what this film is about, identifying what's similar and what's different about them is an important step to at least partially understanding what this film is trying to say. For me, this is a film that covers so many themes. It's about the horrors of the dark web. It's about obsession, particularly about what digital online obsession looks like. Kellyanne's behaviour is extreme, but I think that she kind of prompts us to think how we're all susceptible to acting in obsessive compulsive ways, to secret behaviours that other people don't know about us in that digital world. This is very unsettling and scary to think that there might be many Kellyannes out there. It's also about innocent until proven guilty, and the phenomenon of people falling in love with people accused of terrible crimes. It's about voyeurism. It's about the populist treatment of criminals and the desperate need of victims and the public for someone to be punished, and the obsession that people have with true crime. What the film is actually saying on all of these topics isn't necessarily clear. There's lots of ambiguities, but it never feels like it's leading us up a garden path. I like that it maintains a situation when you can more or less understand what's happening, but you don't necessarily have time to work out how it all fits together. It's one of those films that you only realise at the end quite what you've been through. It's definitely a film that you keep thinking about afterwards. I think it's probably one of those films that deserves a second watch, because the beginning of the film will be different when I watch it with the knowledge of the whole. The acting in the film is very good. The two main characters, Kellyanne and Clementine, effectively carry the film for us, particularly Kellyanne, who's played by Juliette Garriepi. We're never quite sure of her motives, partly because she's so enigmatic. It's a very controlled performance. The smallest gesture that she makes tells us a lot. We're never quite sure if she's as evil as the person who actually committed these horrific murders. In a minute, I'm going to make some comments that contain some spoilers. However, before I do, and without giving too much away, I mentioned that there is a WTF moment in this film. All I'll say at this point is that it's one of the most weird and uncomfortable things that I've seen in a film. It's so creepy, but it involves no blood or gore. It's very simply done in an understated way. But it's just so creepy, horrible, but absolutely thrilling. Right, my next comments will contain some spoilers, so turn off now if you haven't seen the film and you don't want to know what happens. That said, there's so much ambiguity by the end of the film, I don't think it's possible to give any definitive spoilers. Actually, that's not quite true. The film does set up certain expectations at various points, and then they're subverted. This is not least the case with the WTF moment. So this moment is when Kellyanne wears a wig and the same clothes worn by one of the murder victims. We're not quite sure about Kellyanne's motivations until this point. We're still not sure after it, but we do know that she is also seriously disturbed to do such a thing, perhaps even as disturbed as the murderer. This is where the distinction between Kellyanne and Clementine is important, I think. Clementine has no malice, no evil. She's not really engaging in any disturbing behaviour. She seems to be a kind of sad individual with not much happening in her life, and she latches on to the accused. She wants him to be innocent. She is perhaps attracted by his vulnerability. Of course, this is a real phenomenon of people falling for accused killers, or even falling for people who are found guilty. For most of the film, we don't know for certain whether the accused is guilty or not. By the end, this is one certainty that we are given. We're left in no doubt about his guilt. As this becomes clear, Clementine's fantasy is burst, and she returns to reality, and she regrets her former attitude. This really contrasts with Kellyanne. She is really disturbed, as we learn towards the end of the film. She has no fantasy about the accused. In fact, it's down to her forensic work that the case gets definitively solved. However, she's not doing this for justice. If that was her motive, she wouldn't have dressed as one of the murder victims in front of her parents. She wouldn't have broken into the parents' house to take a selfie in the bedroom of the murdered girl. She's not a killer, but her mind is just as twisted. We see her playing online poker all the time, and this is how she seems to earn money. And she makes a comment to Clementine about seeing other people lose. And I think this is her motivation. She just gets a sick pleasure out of seeing people disturbed and people messed up. I think she's fascinated by the parents' loss and grief, not in a compassionate way, but in a way that she gets a kind of perverse pleasure from it. But then there is ambiguity. She's not pure evil. She seems to care about Clementine. She wants to protect her from seeing the horrible films. She kind of knows that she's different from her, and she's nice to her in terms of providing her with food and accommodation, teaching her how to play squash. She clearly has some decency and compassion inside of her. The moment that Kellyanne gets the missing film is really interesting. This is the most animated that we see her. She's so subdued, so emotionless, so calm for most of the film. But this is the moment when she kind of has an ecstatic high. My interpretation of this is that she's a bit like an addict. She stays anaesthetised by getting off on other people's pain, but she's cold and emotionless. Her fix isn't quite giving her the high she's seeking. When she gets that missing film, it's like she's getting a full-on fix. But then we see her face watching it and she's descending back into oblivion. I'm not saying I'm definitively right about this. Nothing is certain at the end of the film, but this interpretation makes sense to me. I actually have no criticisms of this film. I sometimes criticise films that dwell in a miserable view of the world. For example, I've recently criticised the latest Mike Leigh film, Hard Truths, in this way. And in my recent video on Ari Aster films and my second viewing of Beau is Afraid, I levelled the same criticism there also. Films that effectively portray people that are disturbed, but that dwell in the misery with no hope, a totally negative view of the world that I don't share. Red Rooms could fall into this category. There is no hope in this film, except perhaps Clementine's regret around her obsession with the case. But this is only small in relation to the sick behaviour of both the murderer and Kellyanne. Yet I think this film is absolutely brilliant, and I'm not going to make the same criticism of it. I think that the difference is that this film is so intelligent. It's so creative in the way it's made. It's so creative in the writing. It's so creative in raising all the issues and leaving us in a state of ambiguity. A kind of ordered, semi-understandable place, but ambiguity nonetheless. I don't need the film to have hope or some kind of resolution at the end, but if it doesn't, I want it to be great filmmaking, to thrill me, to excite me, to make it impossible to take my eyes off the screen. Red Rooms successfully did this for me. This was a 2024 release in the UK, and if I'd seen it in the cinema during the year, I would definitely have included it in my top 10 for 2024. Not at the top, but definitely in the top half of the list. I highly recommend this film. It's not to be missed. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.